We're going to have a great afternoon. What a fantastic morning. Thanks so much for all of you who came this morning and who'll be here this afternoon. And I'm really excited to have our next speaker because up until a few weeks ago, I had an empty spot here. The reason why was I had somebody I was going to be bringing in, and they wouldn't respond to any of my messages. And it became very scary, and I was doing a presentation about the expedition at an event, and Beth was there, and she goes, well, you know what? I think one of the Bonga family was in the expedition. And I'm like, okay, first of all, who's Bonga? And two, really? And she's like, yeah, I think so. And so when this person wouldn't get back to me, I'm like, okay, I talked to Beth. I said, Beth, do you want to do a presentation? She's like, I don't know. Well, she dove in and did a bunch of research, and you're going to really like what she came up with. I'm really excited to hear it. So from the Marquette Regional History Center, the research librarian, Beth Gruber.
I think I'm going to pull this a little closer just so you can hear me. Okay. There we go. Okay, is that good enough? Okay. So you've all been hearing about the Cass expedition all morning, and in his narrative journals from the expedition, Henry Schoolcraft mentions an Afro-Ojibwa family, and this is quoting from the journal. 3 miles above the mouth of the St. Louis River, there is a village of Chippewa Indians of 14 lodges and containing a population of about 60 souls. Among these, we noticed a Negro who has been long in the service of the fur company and who married a squaw and by whom he has 4 children. It is worthy of remark that the children are as black as the father and have the curled hair and glossy skin of the native African. James Doughty, who also published his journal from the expedition, has a briefer mention just that there was an old Negro in the employ of the company who has a squaw for a wife and their 4 children. So what seemed inconsistent to me was that Schoolcraft and Doughty both failed to mention that one of the guides who was on the expedition was supposedly related to this family. And as Dan said, when I heard his presentation a few weeks ago, I asked him if he had come across anything on the name George Bonga. George is fairly well known in at least the news sources that he was working as a guide and an interpreter on the Cass expedition. So over the last few years, he's talked about quite a lot. There was actually a book published on the family just about 2 months ago. And there was even a play written on George's life that premiered in St. Paul, Minnesota back in 2016. So many of these secondary sources report that Bonga was chosen to participate in the Cass expedition because he was a skilled canoeist, he spoke English, French, and Ojibwa, and he knew the Mississippi headwater areas. He was claimed to be an asset on long portages, that he could carry heavier loads than most of the men, and that he was also very good at keeping up the mood with his fine singing and telling jokes. As part of his work on the expedition, George supposedly worked as a translator on the 1820 Fond du Lac Treaty, except there wasn't one. I went back and looked, and when you look at the signatories on the treaties that were conducted as part of the Cass expedition, George isn't there. In fact, when I looked at the official records, he is not mentioned anywhere by name. I have yet to find any primary sources that directly tie George to the Cass expedition. That being said, I can't definitively state that he wasn't there either. Well, the Native American guides are listed by name. The 10 voyageurs and the 10 soldiers who accompanied the expedition are not listed by name. So he could have been in one of those 20 people, but I don't have any proof of that. He also may have briefly joined the expedition when they were in the Fond du Lac, now the Duluth area, because that's where his family was living, and so maybe he just joined them for a brief period of time, but not the entire expedition. But without that direct connection to the Cass expedition, the Bonga family is still extremely interesting. So who was George Bonga and where did he come from? In one 13-year period in the mid-19th century, George Bonga is listed in various federal, territorial, and state censuses as being white, black, and mulatto. Other records at the time describe him as a half-breed, a mixed blood, or an Indian. This man was described by acquaintances as having coal-black skin, so fairly peculiar. George actually came from the Afro-Ojibwa fur trading family, which was spread over the 1,000 miles between Montreal and what is now Duluth. His father, we believe, was the Negro who had been long in the service of the fur company mentioned by Schoolcraft and Dottie, was of African ancestry, while his mother was Ojibwa. While some scholars have referred to the Bongas as Métis, I have chosen to continue using the terms mixed blood and half-breed because that was the terminology the family themselves used, as well as their contemporaries. Within the Ojibwa community, the Bongas were considered to be primarily ethnically French because of their cultural, linguistic, and social affinity with the French and Métis traders. Many of the people in the frontier de-emphasized the specific ethnic and racial divisions, placing greater importance on the spectrum between what they considered to be civilized and uncivilized. So those lines were based more on education, wealth, status, dress, residence, language skills, and even occupation, rather than their racial identity. So to trace this story, we're going to start back with George's grandparents, Jean and Marie Jean Bonga. Oops. Come on. So this is a family tree of Jean and Marie Bonga, or Jean and Marie Jean Bonga. The Bonga name is reportedly common in southern Africa and Martinique, an island in the Caribbean. In Zulu Swahili, it means to give thanks or to give praise. Around 1782, Jean and Marie Jean Bonga, two Francophone slaves, arrived at colonial Michilimackinac. Their owner was Captain Daniel Robertson, who was the British officer in command of the post. It's unclear how Robertson acquired his ownership of the couple. There are quite a few different stories in various sources as to how they got there. Some stories reported by missionaries in the mid-late to 19th century say that a Bonga ancestor was in fact kidnapped by Native Americans before being adopted into the tribe. Another version states that George's father, who was really his grandfather, was liberated by the local tribe who were incensed by the concept of slavery at Mackinac. Other sources say that Jean was from Jamaica, while other sources claim that the couple had actually been captured in Illinois, probably down in St. Louis, somewhere in that region, during the American Revolution, and then had been brought to Mackinac by slave traders and sold there. In 1872, George reflected on his family history. Quote, "I have always been sorry that I didn't ask my father while living if he knew where he immigrated from. I am now inclined to think that they must have come from the new state of Missouri, as he did not speak anything but French. My grandfather and his family of 5 or 6 children might have been taken prisoner by the Indians and sold to the Indian traders. That is the only way I can guess at it. I understood my father to say that all his father's family came to Mackinac. This I am certain of, for I had 1 uncle and 2 aunts who went to Montreal with the Indian traders." We do know that the owner, Captain Robertson, had actually been posted to Martinique in 1762, so some scholars suspect that he may have purchased the family there. Other recent scholarship has suggested that Robertson may have purchased the couple in Montreal when he lived there before his posting to Mackinac. He could even have inherited them from his wife's family, and they were in the top 10 families within the colony of New France in terms of owning slaves. So they had quite a lot of slaves comparatively. Jean and Marie Jean left a relatively sparse archive. The couple had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The 2 daughters were born at Mackinac. The 2 boys were born probably before they got there. Rosalie was born in 1782 and Charlotte about 1786. There is a record from 1784 which talks about the old Negro Bonga, who was carrying a load of wet linen and was injured after walking into the path of an escaped murderer. We don't really know what happened there, but he was injured. The main records from Mackinac consist of church records. The two girls were baptized, Rosalie in 1786, when her parents were described as a Negro and Negress living with Monsieur Robertson, Captain Commandant. And then it is interesting to note that Jean, Marie-Jean, and the two boys were not baptized there, which indicates they had probably already been baptized, which gives credence to the idea that they may have been in Montreal prior to arriving there. In 1787, several of Captain Robertson's slaves were manumitted, including the Bongas. Even with Robertson, there is quite a bit of confusion in the story. A number of the secondary sources say that they were freed after his death that year. He didn't die that year. He actually just left Mackinac. He actually returned to Montreal and lived there for more than 2 decades. The manumission may have been related to the passing of the Northwest Ordinance, which had banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. So after their manumission, Jean and Marie-Jean actually remained on Mackinac. They purchased a home and opened what is described as the first inn or tavern on Mackinac. Shortly after that, they baptized their younger daughter, and a few months later, they were formally married in the Catholic Church there. Unfortunately, Jean Bonga died just a few months after the wedding in January of 1795, and at this point, his wife disappears from the historical record. Among their 4 children, as George said in that quote from 1872, the 3 children went to Montreal. Etienne, the son, is known to have died there in 1804, and he was listed as a voyageur. That's about all we know about him. We know that the 2 daughters married into the free African community in Montreal. They both married and had children and died in Montreal in the early 1830s. The best documented of their children, of Jean and Marie-Jean, I get the 2 mixed up when I'm talking, was their son Pierre Bonga. Pierre had begun working in the fur trade as a young man, working with traders who frequently passed through Mackinac. In 1795, he was at Fond du Lac with John Sayers Company, and 5 years later, he was working with Alexander Henry the Younger. As many of you, I think, already know, successful fur traders relied on marriage to Native American women because of their ties to the local communities. Marriages allowed the traders to incorporate themselves into the Native American kinship networks with cultural ties that helped them in the fur trade. The wives were serving as active partners most often, traveling with their husbands. They were helping with portages, as well as things like making moccasins, leather garments, and stringing snowshoes. A quote from historian and anthropologist Bruce M. White: "From the point of view of the Native community, marriages between the Native and traders could help achieve the important aim of ensuring a steady supply of merchandise. Ties of affection could increase the likelihood that a trader would return to the community in future years, and he might be more generous with gifts and in the rates for direct trade." Following this practice, Pierre married an Anishinaabe woman, Ojibwe. The name simply translates as Ojibwa woman, so we don't know if that's her actual name. It appears that it was a marriage à la façon du pays, according to the custom of the country, essentially a common law marriage. Ojibwe was probably a member of the Pillager band of Ojibwa at Leech Lake in Minnesota, what is now Minnesota. They were to the west-northwest of modern-day Duluth. The group was considered to be particularly difficult to deal with due to their warrior-like nature and the, quote, uncivilized and unruly individuals. Establishing kinship ties with them was undoubtedly central to the traders' plans and helped with their longevity in the region. Pierre was known as Mukdawos, meaning black-skinned within the tribe. Between 1797 and 1815, the couple had at least 6 children, 2 girls and 4 boys. Pierre was given increasing responsibility, and by 1805, his successes demonstrated in that his wages were nearing that of the two clerks at the same post. They were each making 800 and 900 livres a year, while Pierre was making 750. Pierre was one of the 4 interpreters at the post, and he was the only one without other duties recorded. It is probable that Pierre's sisters, Rosalie and Charlotte, were providing a Montreal support system for the family. But when he sent his children to Montreal for baptism and schooling, he placed them under the care of partners with the Northwest Company that was employing him. The children appear in the St. Gabriel Street Presbyterian Church records among the dozens of fur trade children who had been sent to Montreal. The first was Etienne, named after his uncle, later known as Stephen, who was baptized at age 7 in 1810. The following year, 9-year-old Blanche and 7-year-old George were baptized. They were sponsored by Pierre's superiors Angus Shaw and Archibald Norman MacLeod, and they were described as being the children of Pierre Bongo in the service of the Northwest Company by a woman in the Indian country. An older son, John Baptiste, was also apprenticed to MacLeod in 1812 at the age of 14. Pierre worked for the Northwest Company until 1817 before switching to work for the Southwest Company, which was a subsidiary of the American Fur Company. He only remained with them for a few years before he seems to have retired, and he seems to have stopped working around 1820, 1821, and he is believed to have died in 1831. There we go. So we're going to go back to George, and this is a picture of George from circa 1865. George, as I had mentioned earlier, had been sent to Montreal for schooling. In 1872, he noted, quote, "I left Ojibwa country when I was a little boy, as I have no recollection of the place, and went to school in Montreal." After he returned, George spoke several languages, including English, French, Ojibwa, and he is believed to have spoken other Native American dialects. From 1820 to 1839, George primarily worked from the American Fur Company, beginning his career as a boatman. He was reportedly 6 feet tall, weighed 200 pounds, and was immensely strong. During the portages, most voyageurs would carry 2 90-pound bundles. On one occasion, George is reported to have carried 7 bundles, some 630 pounds, for half a mile. I have to think that's an exaggeration of his strength. He may have been stronger than most of the other men, but 630 seems excessive. By 1833 to 1834, George was licensed to trade as a clerk at the Lac Platte post southwest of Fond du Lac. As the clerk, he managed the trading conducted from the post, and it was his responsibility to see that the wintering season was successful. In this position, he supervised the interpreters, hunters, and voyageurs. In 1836, he was tasked with setting up a new post at Otter Tail Lake, although the post did not succeed because of its location situated between Ojibwa and Dakota territory. It appears that the risks of intertribal conflict were significant enough that the voyageurs and traders were not willing to travel to the post. The following year, in 1837, George was fairly well known for tracking down an Ojibwa man, Chigawaskung, who was accused of murdering Alfred Aiken at Red Cedar Lake, which is now Cass Lake. Alfred was the son of George's boss, William Aitken. George had trailed Chigawaskung over 5 days and 6 nights through the winter before bringing him back to Fort Snelling to face trial. The ensuing criminal trial was reputedly the first in what was then part of Wisconsin territory. Unfortunately, Chigawaskung was acquitted because Alfred Aiken was half Ojibwa, and the court decided that they had no jurisdiction over a case involving Native Americans. George was unpopular with some other members of the tribe because of his role in this case, but he did continue living with the tribe for the rest of his life. In 1842, George married an Ojibwa woman himself, Ashwin. They had at least 5 children together. In the 1840s, the fur trade started to decline, and so George and Ashwin began turning to lodge keeping at their home at Leech Lake. And for many years, they welcomed travelers. One of the travelers, Judge Charles Flandreau, spent 2 weeks at the Bonga's Lodge in 1856. Years later, he described the visit saying, quote, "He was a thorough gentleman in both feeling and deportment, and was very anxious to contribute to my pleasure during my stay with him. He loved to dwell upon the grandeur of the chief factors of the old fur company, and to show me how royally they traveled. He got up an excursion on the lake in a splendid birch bark canoe, manned by 12 men who paddled to the music of a French-Canadian boat song, led by himself. George was very popular with the whites and loved to relate to the newcomers his adventures. He was about the blackest man I ever saw, so black that his skin fairly glistened, but was, excepting his brother Jack, the only black person in the country. Having never heard of any distinction between the people but that of between Indians and white men, he would frequently paralyze his listeners while reminiscing by saying, 'Gentlemen, I assure you that Jack Banfield and myself were the first 2 white men that ever came into this country.' As we've previously discussed, I can't prove that George was a guide or interpreter during the Cass expedition, but he is a signatory on other treaties. In 1847, he worked as an interpreter on the treaty with the Pillagers signed at Leech Lake. And 2 decades later, in 1867, he actually traveled to Washington, D.C. to serve as a witness at the signing of a major treaty reducing the size of the local Leech Lake Reservation and establishing a large new reservation at White Earth. Between the 2 treaties, George worked as an interpreter for the local Indian agent from 1865 to 1867, and he also served as the superintendent of the government farm at the Leech Lake Reservation. During the 1860s, Bonga was known for writing letters on behalf of the Ojibwa complaining to the state government about individual Indian agents in the region. His letters are mostly held at the Minnesota State Historical Society. The letters point out both his connections with the white government and with the Ojibwa, but he still refers to them as the Indians, as a group quite separate from his own identity. While he was deeply concerned for their well-being and had kinship ties with them, it is also clear from his writing that he considered himself to be vastly different from the, quote, ignorant Indians. George does not appear to have had a firmly entrenched identity as an Ojibwa because he didn't grow up with them. Rather, he reveals a rather paternalistic attitude towards the community. George died in his lodge in 1874, and I have to note that some of the stories told about the family give multiple other dates, sometimes multiple dates within the same article. The family has suffered quite a bit from copy and paste research, where people will just find somebody else and just cut it into their own articles. And so they've confused the death dates of various family members. So I think that's where some of these confusions about the family have come from. Oops, that already switched over. So George's brother, Stephen, was born near the mouth of the St. Louis River in 1798. He is described as being the first person of African ancestry to be born in the Duluth area, although we think they actually had an older sister. We're not sure where she was born. Stephen was baptized in Montreal, but was reportedly sent to Albany, New York, to study to become a Presbyterian minister. He did not finish his schooling and eventually returned to the Lake Superior region, where he and George went into the fur trade with their father, working for the American Fur Company. Stephen married an Ojibwa woman, recorded as Mary, and they had at least 2 children. Like George, Stephen was often called upon as a translator, assisting with Native and non-Native communications. In 1837, he served as the interpreter at Minnesota's Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, or for Wisconsin Territory Governor Henry Dodge, who was trying to negotiate a peace treaty between a band of Ojibwa and a band of Dakota. The treaty was signed, and even though Stephen was working as a clerk and serving as an interpreter. You can see here he did actually sign with his mark rather than his own signature, which suggests that he may have been illiterate even given all of his schooling. Although Stephen left the Presbyterian seminary, he is known for his piety throughout his life. In 1838, he was hired as an interpreter by Methodist missionary Alfred Brunson, who described Stephen as, quote, religious and included to the missions, speaking both languages with fluency and correctness. This missionary would actually have a significant impact on Stephen's sister Marguerite, who will be discussed in a few minutes. During the bitterly cold December of 1850, Stephen and his wife were part of a group of 3,000 Lake Superior Ojibwa who traveled 500 miles from Wisconsin to Minnesota's Sandy Lake to receive annuities that had been promised to them by treaties. The meeting place was a disguised effort by the government to force the tribe to permanently relocate. When they arrived, they did not receive the annuities, and instead were provided with moldy flour and spoiled meat, leading to outbreaks of measles and food poisoning. Some 150 people died initially, and another 400 died during the trip home due to food poisoning, hunger, or exposure. Stephen continued working as a voyageur. In 1857, he was actually asked to guide artist Eastman Johnson through the Lake Superior region to paint the Ojibwa people and their land. The tour included the present-day locations of Grand Portage National Monument, the Apostle Islands National Monument, and Isle Royale National Park. The resulting oil paintings, charcoals, and pastel drawings have gained renewed interest through national exhibitions. Stephen died in Superior, Wisconsin in 1884. There we go. There we go. So, Stephen and George's sister, Marguerite, was probably the oldest child in the family, born around 1797, and her native name may have been Kijiji. Marguerite married another employee of the American Fur Company, further extending the family's kinship network. Her husband was Jacob Falstrom, who is considered to be the first Swedish immigrant to both Manitoba and Minnesota. Jacob was known as a wanderer and had come to Canada working for the Hudson Bay Company. Like the other family members, there are multiple stories as to how he ended up in Canada. After his contract with the Hudson Bay Company, he briefly worked for the Northwest Company and then went to work for the American Fur Company, which is presumably how he came into contact with the Bongas. By 1819, Jacob was near the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers when the U.S. Army arrived to establish Fort Snelling. Jacob and Marguerite married at Fond du Lac in 1823, and they had probably 9 children. There's a couple of repeated names that appear to be children that died young, and the names were reused, but it's not entirely clear how many children they had. Around 1825, Jacob was working as a striker in the blacksmith shop at Fort Snelling and at the nearby St. Peter's Indian Agency. The striker was usually an assistant, and the blacksmith would indicate where to tap something with a small hammer, and then the striker would use the big hammer to actually do the work. The Falstrom's home is recorded as a blacksmith shop on a map of the area made in 1832. Jacob was also known for supplying the fort with wood and worked as a mail carrier, taking mail up the St. Croix River, going as far as Lake Superior, and heading as far south as Prairie du Chien. Although it's not possible to confirm at this time, he may have been on Henry Schoolcraft's 1832 expedition to discover the source of the Mississippi River. Schoolcraft does not provide any descriptive details, but one of the guides on the trip was named Ozawindib, Yellowhead, which was the Native American name used by Jacob, but there were known to be other people with that name in the region. So it's not clear which of the Ozawindibs was the guide on that 1832 expedition. The Falstroms and others had been allowed to settle near Fort Snelling because they were considered to be useful. But following a further treaty with the Native Americans, the civilians were finally asked to leave, and those who resisted were forcibly evicted. The Fallstroms simply moved across the Mississippi River, not realizing that was still Fort Land. They were evicted 2 more times before they finally decided to walk east as far as they could before the sun set to be sure that they would be well and truly away from the Army. The family finally settled on a farm near the Wisconsin state line. As I had mentioned, Stephen had been working for a Methodist missionary, and around 1838, that missionary set up the Kaposia Methodist Mission in an attempt to convert the Native Americans, and one of the best converts they had was Marguerite's husband, Jacob. Brunson considered the conversion of the Fallstrom family to be his most significant achievement in the area. He wrote in his memoirs, quote, "The state of things among the Indians was very detrimental to our operations among them, yet we were not without some fruit. Jacob Fallstrom was converted, which led to the conversion of his family and their education, and they are yet doing good in Minnesota. The conversion of this family and their subsequent respectability and usefulness as the fruit of our missionary operations in that country was worth all its cost." Jacob became known as Father Jacob, and he was licensed as an exhorter or lay preacher for the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1840. He was fluent in Ojibwa, English, French, Dakota, Iroquois, and his native Swedish, and he preached in all of those languages. His circuit stretched from the Rum River up to Lake Superior, and he was often away from home for extensive periods of time, traveling throughout the region. And he was considered to be one of the most successful missionaries to the Native Americans in the region. While Jacob traveled, Margaret and her children kept open their house for the weary and sometimes hungry circuit riders. Several Fallstrom members, including Margaret, are listed in class records in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And it is recorded that Margaret, or in this case Margaret rather than Marguerite, was a woman of fine mind. With her limited educational privileges, very few of any age or race can be found her equal. Mr. and Mrs. Fallstrom were both consistent Christians and member of the Methodist Church for many years. Their daughter, Nancy Fallstrom, was also remembered as being a woman of rare intellect and accomplishments who served as an interpreter during services and meetings in which the missionaries conducted at Red Rock Prairie. Even with her conversion to Methodism, Margaret and her children retained some of their Ojibwa culture. The family is reported to have spoke Ojibwa at home, and each spring the family visited the maple-covered Manitou Island in the middle of White Bear Lake to make maple sugar. Jacob died in 1859 and is buried in a cemetery on the family farm, and Marguerite survived him by 21 years, dying there in 1880. So this is somebody I'm not actually talking about. This is other family members that we do have pictures of. This is George's son, William Bonga. And then this is a picture, and there are 2 Bonga descendants in the top upper corners, both corners. On the top left is Paul Bonga, who was a son of Stephen, and the top right is William Bonga, George's son. So, the last of Pierre and Ojibwe-Kwe's children was Jack, and he's the only one of the sons with a recorded Native American name, Enodagan. He was born much later than his siblings, around 1817. And as part of these kin networks, Jack actually married his sister-in-law, Ashwin, George's wife's sister, Data Gemwikabe, I believe I said that right. She was known as Data. In the 1860 census, Jack and Data are listed with 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy. And one of their daughters, Canib, extended the family's kin network by marrying William Warren, who was a grandson of William Aiken, the fur trader that George had worked for several decades earlier. So these were all interrelated families. The marriages worked to cement Jack and George's ties in the Pillager region, as well among the trader families in the Fond du Lac department. So this last one, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of, but this would be George's daughter, Susan. And she was one of the first ones to feel real issues with her with her African heritage. Her native name was Mukamanukwe. She was born around 1853 and was raised primarily by her Ojibwa mother, Ashwin. In the Ojibwa culture, mothers typically assumed full responsibility for their infant children until they weaned. And then as the children grew older, they would either go, the boys with their fathers and the girls with their mothers. So in keeping with this practice, Susan was educated differently from her family. So she attended the Indian boarding school at Leech Lake rather than being sent east like her brothers to attend school. The Leech Lake boarding school was opened around 1860 and was run by a Congregationalist minister. Susan excelled at the school, learning domestic skills, religious instruction, and speaking English. Shortly after she graduated, she was hired as the school's matron to, quote, cook for all the students while instructing the girls in food preparation, helping them to create their wardrobes while teaching them how to sew, and bathing them while informing them of sanitary practice, in addition to providing a motherly figure. The goal was changing every aspect of Native American households. There was particularly a drive to transform Native American women and girls into the vehicles of perpetuating civilization into their communities. Susan took on a leadership role among the Indian women, but she was also known for advising the men in her family. Particularly, her brothers kept asking her advice on their business practices. When Charles Wright, whose Ojibwa name was Nashota, was an Ojibwa Episcopal deacon, arrived at Leech Lake as a missionary in 1880, he took over as teacher of the day school. In their role as teacher and matron, Charles and Susan worked closely together, and as their relationship developed, they began to discuss marriage. But there was a question about whether Susan's black ancestry would undermine her position as the minister's wife. One of the other missionaries wrote to the bishop about the situation. Quote, Reverend Charles Wright of Leech Lake asked me to write to you about the propriety of his marrying Miss Susie Bonga, the daughter of the late George Bonga, whom you knew. She has a reputation of being an exceedingly wise, chaste, and good religious woman, one who is exceedingly highly thought of by all the white employees at Leech Lake and respected by all Indians and whites. She is a very good housekeeper, speaks English pretty well, has considerable learning, is of spotless character, and has on all accounts been advanced to the position of matron at the Indian school, which she fulfills perfectly. There is no doubt that if she continues as she has done in the past, she would advance his work far more than any other wife he could find, Indian or white. He wishes to marry her. There is only one thing that sticks in his mind, her Negro blood. He has heard that white people look down on Negroes. She shows the Negro blood but little. Her hair is perfectly straight, and her lips are not like the Negro, but her brothers and sisters show it very much. Evidently, the concerns were resolved, and the couple did marry in 1882, more than 2 years after that original letter was sent to the bishop. After marrying, Susan continued her leadership role among the women of Leech Lake. Interestingly, she appears to have not been as perfectly assimilated as the missionary was indicating in his letter to the bishop. Another missionary, Pauline Colby, referred to Susan as Mrs. Natosha rather than by Mrs. Wright. And she also recorded several incidents in which Susan displayed Ojibwa ideas about property, referring to the concept of communally owned property, and particularly thinking that it was appropriate for people to take food from those who had it to give more to those who did not. She also continued to exercise Ojibwa forms of social governance in the women's work groups, such as making political decisions through consensus and distributing goods to community members. So, the Bonga family built a dynasty within the fur trade, securing their name, reputation, and fortune for themselves. They had an intergenerational pattern of paying attention to and cultivating the Fur Trade Society's kin networks and the customs of reciprocity to integrate themselves into their communities in a world where fixed notions of their identity were fluid. Because they were good at building alliances and secured advantageous marriages, particularly within the Ojibwa community, they were able to lead the lives of typical traders. Currently, Bonga Township in Cass County, Minnesota is named after the family, and their descendants can still be found within the local Ojibwa community. Thank you. Yeah. What, this? No. Oh. Oh, Marty's got a question.
All right, questions, Marty?
So you mentioned William Warren?
Yes.
Is that the William Warren Whipple? Ojibwe history?
It's his son.
His son. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Are there other questions? Russ?
Russ? And I should say thank you to Russ, because it was one of his articles that first introduced me to the Bongas.
Did you run across anything of one of the Bongas, probably the son of the original family, John and Marie, being involved in the creation of a fur trading post, and sometimes they say it's the creation of Menominee, Michigan?
No, I didn't see anything about Menominee. But I know I didn't get into everything. There is a lot out there on them. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, how long did the voyagers last? Because that had to be a very rugged life and everything.
I don't actually remember. I know they were quite long. Do any of the other historians in the room know? I'm not remembering off the top of my head.
As to, like, age-wise, how old was George when he died away?
George was about 72-ish.
So that actually probably
Yeah.
would have been old for a voyager, and it probably is because he was a trader as well, and so he got out of the business of doing all the work. The voyagers, the actual guys who did the paddling and everything, were, I think, in their 50s was probably average if they got that far, because it was incredibly hard. He talked about the weight that he carried. Now they carry 2 packs each, 180 pounds each trip. But at night, they would often sit around campfires and they would challenge each other to who could carry the most packs. And unfortunately, this often led to hernias, because they oftentimes were beveraged, is how I'd like to put it. And I've wondered about this myself. I'm a descendant of voyagers, and my uncles and my dad were the same way. They get a few in them, and they'd start challenging each other, who could do this and who could do that. And so it doesn't surprise me that that was the case. Also, many of them could not swim. They were hired if they could not swim because they didn't want them to take chances on the canoes. And so many of them drowned. So there was a lot of different ways. And so, yeah, they didn't generally live long, helpful lives. But that 72 is pretty good for a former voyageur.
Well, his brother Stephen was supposed to have been 86.
Wow, that's great.
Why don't we see where their feet are? Is it the image that's cut off, or why is that done?
What? I didn't.
Oh, he's wondering why their feet were cropped out of all the photos.
Those were the copies of the images I received. I don't know if that was in the original or whoever digitized the images.
Yeah, it's hard to say. That's a good question. Early photography is an intriguing thing. We got a gentleman over here who wants to ask a question. I'll get back to you, Russ.
I think in that last picture, there's George has his lips like closed up. Is he trying to hide his African American lips, or is that just?
I don't know.
Okay.
That was actually the 2 cousins, so that was Paul and William. But It could be, it
I
could
wasn't
just
sure.
be.
You thought it said something about their lips earlier in the talk, so I just thought
Yeah.
you might have been like.
I have no idea what they were thinking when they took that picture. I mean, it could just be that taking pictures takes a long time at that time frame, and you're just not going to smile because it's harder to maintain a smile. It could have been something to hide the African ancestry. I just don't know. I don't have that much insight into their thoughts.
You know, I've noticed, looking at, looking at material with the Bonga family, it seems that, I don't know if it's my imagination or whatever, it seems that Minnesota is excited about them and they show up, et cetera.
Yeah.
Michigan, very little or nothing dealing with the family
Yeah.
or the name. When you put the name online, Minnesota shows
up.
Michigan's,
I think that's because that was where Pierre settled, because the family was only at Mackinac for a decade and a half, roughly, and then they moved to Duluth, the Duluth area, and stayed there. So I think that's the primary reason. There just aren't very many records of them at Mackinac. It's those few baptismal and marriage records, and then a few mentions in the household of Captain Robertson. Everything else primarily goes to Duluth and Minnesota, so there's more information there.
Any other questions? Beth is a fantastic research. Thanks for jumping
Yeah,
into the void and
thanks.
doing a great research.